I was standing in the model unit on the 14th floor when it happened. The whole west wall made of glass, the Chicago skyline going soft and orange behind me, the way it does right before the light gives up for the night. The clipboard sat on the stone kitchen island, and a bottle of wine stood open on the counter that neither of us had touched. I heard the elevator before I heard her, then the door, then her footsteps on the new hardwood, and then Dana was standing there with that same brown leather clipboard in her hands, the papers clipped inside it, fluttering slightly from the draft. She crossed the room and stopped a step away from me, close enough that I could hear her breathing change. She set the clipboard down on the island and then picked it back up, held it out toward me the way you'd hand someone a contract that needed signing. Except her eyes weren't on the papers, they were on me. For 3 seconds, neither of us said anything. The city kept moving 20 stories below, and none of it seemed to matter inside that room. "My father said you needed a wife," she whispered. I looked down at the clipboard, then back up at her face, and I didn't look away. He was right. That's where it happened. That's the moment. But I'm going to have to start from the beginning, because you won't understand why 4 words could undo 3 years of careful silence unless I tell you everything that came before them. My name is Ryan Cole. I'm 33 years old, and I design interiors for a living, mostly commercial spaces, sometimes residential, always with the same idea driving me, which is that a room should make a person feel like they can finally exhale. I work for a firm called Meridian Studio out of River North, a mid-sized outfit, nothing flashy, the kind of place that gets hired because the work speaks for itself rather than because of who we know. I live alone in a studio apartment in Wicker Park. It's got everything I need and nothing I don't. A few sketches taped to the wall, none of them framed. No photographs on the shelf, because there was never anyone I wanted to put there, or maybe because I never let myself think about it long enough to notice the shelf was empty. I chose that life. I want to be clear about that. Nobody forced solitude on me. I built it, board by board, the same way I build everything else, careful and quiet, and without much fanfare. I've never been divorced, never come close to married. People assume there's a story behind that, some heartbreak I'm still nursing. But the truth is simpler and less interesting than that. I just never let anyone stay long enough to matter. It was easier that way. Or it seemed easier, back before I understood what easier actually cost me. I don't design things to impress anyone. I never have. When a client asks me for something grand, I try to talk them toward something honest instead, because grand fades and honest doesn't. I want people to walk into a room I built and feel their shoulders drop an inch without knowing why. 3 years ago, a colleague passed my name along to a man named Frank Whitfield, who owned a mid-sized commercial real estate company on the north side of the city. His first project for me was a stretch of office space in Fulton Market. Nothing enormous, but it was the kind of job that could open doors if I did it right. The first time I met Frank, he was 64 years old, built like a man who used to do physical work before he started signing checks for people who did. His office smelled like coffee that had gone cold hours earlier, and the light coming through the blinds was that particular late afternoon yellow that makes everything look older than it is. He shook my hand hard and dry, held it a second longer than most people do, and looked at me the same way. A beat too long. "You have the eyes of someone who pays attention," he said. I didn't know if that was a compliment or a warning, and honestly, I still don't fully know, even now, all this time later. 30 seconds after Frank walked into that first meeting, the door opened again, and a woman walked in carrying a brown leather clipboard, the same one that would later change everything. She set it on the table, sat down, opened the folder clipped inside it, and asked me a question before anyone had even said her name. I remember sitting there for 2 full seconds, just watching her, before I remembered I was supposed to answer. That was Donna, Frank's daughter and the project manager on his side of the job. She had a way of talking that didn't waste anything. No small talk, no filler, just the next relevant thing that needed saying. I found out later that most people mistook that for coldness. I never did. It read to me like someone who respected other people's time too much to pad the conversation. For 4 months, we worked together on that Fulton Market space, professional and efficient the entire time. I didn't say more to her than I had to. She didn't say more to me than she had to. It was, by every outward measure, a completely ordinary working relationship. Meetings, site walks, the occasional disagreement about a finish or a fixture that got resolved in under a minute because neither of us wanted to argue longer than necessary. When the project wrapped, Frank handed me that same clipboard. The leather already worn soft at the corners, even back then. The way leather gets when somebody's used it for years without babying it. "You did good work," he told me. "Keep this. A man who does good work deserves something that lasts." Dana stood beside him while he said it, watching me take it into my hands. She didn't say a word. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was just Frank being sentimental about an old office supply. I didn't think about it any harder than that. I had no reason to yet. I kept the clipboard, set it on the corner of my desk back at Meridian, right beside my ruler and my drafting pens, and I couldn't have told you why I kept it there instead of putting it in a drawer somewhere and forgetting about it. 2 years passed. I didn't think about Dana Whitfield. Or maybe I made myself not think about her, which isn't quite the same thing, though at the time I would have told you it was. Then, this past January, Frank called me again. He had the biggest project of his career on the table, an 18-story luxury apartment building going up in Lincoln Park, and he wanted me specifically to handle every inch of the interior work. "I want you," he said. "Nobody else." I said yes before I even thought to ask who'd be running the project on his end. There was no hesitation in it, none at all, just an easy, immediate yes, the kind you give when you trust the person asking and you like the shape of the work. I had no idea, when I hung up that phone, that Dana was still there, still his project manager, still the one person who would be sitting across the table from me for the next year of my life and who would end up meaning more to me than any building I'd ever design. The first week back, Dana and I saw each other in Frank's office, and she didn't act like 2 years had passed at all. She just nodded, said, "Good to work with you again," and opened her folder like we'd left off the day before instead of 24 months earlier. I told myself that was just how she operated, efficient, no wasted motion. I'd built a version of her in my head over those 2 years without meaning to, someone sharp and a little distant, and in that first meeting she matched it well enough that I stopped thinking about it at all, told myself I'd simply remembered her correctly. But it didn't take long for me to notice something underneath that efficiency. She'd read every page of my old project files, the ones from Fulton Market, and the questions she asked in that first meeting weren't the kind you ask when you're skimming a summary the night before. They were the kind you ask when you've gone back through the details on purpose, more than once. She asked about a load-bearing decision I'd made 18 months earlier that most people in that room wouldn't have remembered existed, let alone questioned with any real understanding of why I'd made it. She'd prepared. Nobody makes her prepare like that. She chose to, and it took me a while to understand what that choice actually meant. The clipboard was still with her. Same one. Brown leather, corners worn a little softer than I remembered, the stitching along one edge starting to give the way stitching does after enough years of being carried under someone's arm. She carried it into every meeting, set it on the table the same way she had 3 years earlier, and I kept noticing it out of the corner of my eye, thinking it was strange that Frank had never replaced it with something new. Whitfield Properties could have afforded 10,000 clipboards, sleek ones, the kind other executives carried. He kept using the same one, and so, apparently, did she. And there was something about that consistency that I found myself paying more attention to than I should have. There were evenings that first month when I stayed late at the model unit, measuring things twice because I wanted to get them right the first time on paper, checking sight lines from the kitchen to the window, testing whether the hallway felt like a hallway or like a corridor. a distinction that matters more than people think. Dana would sometimes show up with a folder of her own, not because she needed to be there, but because the numbers she was working through happened to live in the same building I did. She'd take the corner of the kitchen island, spread her papers out under the bare pendant light we hadn't finished wiring yet, and work in silence a few feet away from me. Neither of us needed to fill that silence with anything. The only sounds were her pen against paper and my own pencil sliding across a plan, and somehow that quiet felt less like the absence of conversation and more like a conversation of its own kind. It became, without either of us naming it, one of the more comfortable parts of my week. One evening, she asked why I'd chosen a lighter wood than what was in the original spec. I explained it, walked her through the way the light would hit it in the afternoon, how the darker tone in the original plan would have made the whole room feel like it was waiting for a funeral instead of a housewarming. I picked up the sample and held it under the pendant light so she could see what I meant, the grain catching gold instead of going flat and brown. She was quiet for a second, studying the sample in her hand, turning it over once like she was weighing something more than wood, and then she said, "That's better." No explanation, no further comment, just those 2 words, and then she went back to her papers like she hadn't just complimented me at all, though I noticed she kept the sample on the island a little longer than she needed to before setting it aside. Frank came by the site now and then, and I noticed a pattern in how he did it. He'd walk through the first few rooms with both of us, ask a question or two about timeline, nod at whatever I told him without ever really doubting it, and then he'd find some reason to hang back, a phone call, a question for the site supervisor, something that always seemed to surface right as we reached the harder rooms to finish. He'd let Dana and me finish the walkthrough alone, the 2 of us moving from unit to unit, while he stayed a floor behind with his phone to his ear. "You 2 have a good eye together," he told us more than once, always in the same easy tone, like he was commenting on the weather instead of something he'd clearly been watching closely. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had no reason to look for a pattern in something that sounded so ordinary, and if I'm honest, I liked those walkthroughs more than I let myself admit, the 2 of us moving through empty rooms that hadn't found their furniture yet, deciding together what kind of life they'd eventually hold. One night, after a longer meeting than usual, one that had run past 8 because the permitting office had thrown a wrench into the timeline nobody saw coming, Dana and I ended up walking out of the building at the same time, both of us hungry, both of us near the same small Italian place 2 blocks over that stayed open late enough to catch people like us. Neither of us suggested it directly. We just sort of ended up at the same table, and it didn't feel like a date, not exactly, more like 2 people too tired to eat alone deciding not to. The place had candles on every table, the kind that came in little glass jars, and the light off them made the whole room look softer than it probably was. She ordered pasta. I ordered soup, something simple, and neither of us apologized for how tired we looked. She told me about a project from 5 years earlier that she'd nearly turned down, something about a difficult client and a design she hadn't believed in until halfway through, and how she'd learned something about herself finishing it anyway, some stubborn streak she hadn't known she had, until the client tried to talk her out of the very thing that ended up making the project work. I listened. I didn't say much, mostly because I didn't need to, because she talked the way some people only talk when they've decided, somewhere below the surface, that the person across from them is worth the extra sentence. At some point, she looked at me across the table and asked, "Why are you always so quiet?" "I'm listening," I told her. She didn't say anything else after that. But she didn't look away either. She just held my eyes for a moment longer than the question needed, and then she picked her fork back up like nothing had happened. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that later that same week, Dana sat across from Carol Breen, Frank's longtime assistant, in the break room at the Whitfield offices, 2 coffees between them, and told her, without much fanfare, that she liked the way I worked. "He doesn't perform," she said. "He just does it." Carol just nodded. the way people do when they already suspect something and are simply waiting for confirmation to catch up to it. Carol had worked for Frank for the better part of 2 decades. She'd seen Dana date exactly one man in that time, and she'd never once heard Dana talk about him this way, not even at the start. And around that same time, Frank pulled Carol aside in his office, door half shut, and said something I wouldn't hear about until much later. "She looks at him," he told her, "the way she never looked at Derek." Carol nodded again, said nothing back, because there was nothing that needed saying. Neither of them told me. Neither of them told Dana they'd had the conversation at all. It just existed, quietly, somewhere I couldn't see it, the way most important things seem to start, off to the side, in rooms the people it's actually about never get invited into. In March, Frank asked me to stay behind after a site meeting, waited until the rest of the team had cleared out before he spoke. He told me about a heart scare he'd had, nothing dramatic, a tightness in his chest one morning that turned out to be manageable, but enough that his doctor had told him to slow down, delegate more, stop carrying every worry himself the way he'd carried them for 40 years. And then, without much transition, he started talking about Dana. Not pushing, just observing, the way a father does when he's spent a long time watching someone he loves from a careful distance. "My daughter needs a partner," he said. "Not just someone who does the job." I nodded. I didn't say anything back, because I honestly didn't know what to say, and because some part of me suspected that whatever I said next would matter more than I was ready for it to matter. It felt like a door had opened somewhere in the room, and I wasn't sure yet whether I was allowed to walk through it, or whether I even understood what was on the other side. That night, back in my apartment, I found myself looking at that clipboard on my desk for longer than I usually did, and for the first time, a question surfaced that I hadn't thought to ask in 3 years. Why had Dana been the one to hand it to me? Frank was standing right there. He could have given it to me himself. I didn't have an answer. I just noticed, the way you notice a detail in a room you've walked through 100 times, and only on the 101st time do you finally see it clearly, the way a shadow falls differently at 4 in the afternoon than it does at noon, and you'd never know it unless you happened to be standing there at exactly the right hour. And once I'd seen it, I started noticing other things too. The way Dana's hand would rest on the leather cover of that clipboard during meetings, almost without her realizing it. Resting there the way you'd rest a hand on the back of a chair you trusted. The way her fingers would tap, once, twice, against the corner of it when she was thinking hard about something, a habit she clearly didn't know she had, one that surfaced only when the topic on the table mattered more than the others. I started watching for it without meaning to. I couldn't have told you why. Not yet, but I was watching, and somewhere underneath the watching, something in me had already begun to shift, quietly. The way weather shifts before anyone notices, the sky has changed color. In April, a man named Derek Lund walked into a subcontractor meeting for the finish work on the ground floor commercial space, and I understood immediately that he wasn't just another vendor. He'd won the bid fair and square, the paperwork was clean, his portfolio was legitimate, and there was nothing wrong with him being there on paper. It was everything else about him that felt wrong. Something in the way he carried himself into the room like he already owned a piece of it. He was an independent architect, mid-30s. The kind of man who talked about his projects the way other people talk about their children, with a pride that tipped slightly too far past confidence and into something else. I'd heard his name once or twice before, secondhand, in the way you hear about people who circle the edges of an industry without ever quite settling anywhere long enough to build a real reputation. He crossed the room and shook my hand, gripping it a little harder than necessary, smiling a little wider than the moment called for. "Brian Cole," he said. "I've heard good things. It should have landed as a compliment." It didn't. There was something underneath the words, some current running the other direction, and I noticed, before he'd even finished the sentence, that his eyes had gone to Dana first and only came to me second, almost as an afterthought, a fraction of a second that told me more than the handshake did. In that first joint meeting, Derek kept proposing changes, small ones, nothing that mattered structurally, but enough to keep steering the conversation back toward himself. He'd suggest an alternate material here, a different sightline there, always framed as an improvement, always requiring another round of discussion where he got to be the one talking, walking the room through his reasoning, with the confidence of a man who assumed nobody in it had spent as many hours thinking about the problem as he had. It wasn't about the work, it was about who got to make the calls in the room. Every time Dana had to say, "We'll need to review that," his eyes would cut to me, quick and pointed, like he was keeping score of something only he understood the rules to, some private contest I hadn't agreed to enter. After that meeting, Dana caught up with me in the hallway outside the conference room, her heels quick against the concrete floor that hadn't been carpeted yet. "He and I used to date," she said. "Nothing more. No context, no explanation of how long it lasted or how it ended. No reassurance offered up front, just the fact itself, delivered plainly, the way she delivered most things." "Okay," I said. She looked at me like she was waiting for something else, some question, some reaction, maybe even some flicker of jealousy she could read something into. I didn't have one ready, not because I didn't feel anything, but because I hadn't yet let myself examine what I felt closely enough to put a name to it. I just nodded again and let the silence sit there between us until she finally turned and walked back toward her office, her clipboard tucked under one arm, and I stood there for a second longer than I needed to, trying to figure out why my chest had gone tight over 4 words that shouldn't have mattered to me at all, and somehow mattered more than almost anything else that had happened that week. Derek tried to work his way back into her life first. I heard about it secondhand, weeks later, the way most of these things get told to you after the fact, pieced together from a comment Carol made and a detail Dana finally let slip herself. He'd cornered her near the parking garage one evening, waiting by her car in a way that felt more staged than coincidental, and told her she'd been working too hard, that she needed someone who actually understood her world, someone who spoke the same language she did, someone, by implication, who wasn't a mid-tier interior designer with a rented studio apartment in Wicker Park. Dana told him no. Flat, direct, no room left for interpretation, and she didn't dress it up with an excuse either, because she'd never needed one before and wasn't about to start now. She told Carol later that she'd almost laughed at the timing of it, how a man who'd never once shown up for her when they were actually together suddenly had all the time in the world to show up in a parking garage the moment someone else started to matter to her. When that didn't work, he changed strategy. He found me alone one afternoon on the 9th floor, standing over a set of drawings spread across a plywood table, and he leaned against the door frame like he had all the time in the world, watching me work for a moment before he spoke. "Frank asked me to take a look at your work," he said, casual as anything, like he was mentioning the weather. "Just a second opinion. Wanted to make sure everything's solid before we get too far in." I didn't believe him. Something in the way he said it felt rehearsed, too smooth, like a line he'd practiced in the elevator on the way up, timed to land exactly the way it landed. But I didn't argue. I just said I appreciated the diligence and went back to my drawings, and I kept the whole exchange to myself for a few days because I didn't yet know what to do with it, and because some part of me still wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt he clearly hadn't earned, the way you sometimes extend patience to people you already suspect don't deserve it. Dana found out the truth through Carol a few days later. A passing comment in the hallway that Carol hadn't meant as anything more than small talk, mentioning that Frank hadn't reviewed anyone's drawings in months. Dana put it together fast. Frank had never asked Derek to review anything. He hadn't spoken to Derek about my work at all, hadn't so much as mentioned my name to him outside of scheduling. Dana confronted him about it directly, no hedging, cornering him the way he'd cornered her by the parking garage. And Derek didn't apologize. He just shrugged it off. "I was just trying to help move things forward," he said. like the lie itself had been some kind of favor to everyone involved, a gift nobody had asked for and nobody wanted, delivered with the easy confidence of a man who'd never once had to answer for anything in his life. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, Derek sent an email to the project's management team. An email that never named names outright, but was written carefully enough that everyone who read it understood exactly who it was about, alleging a conflict of interest between the lead designer and the project manager on the client's side, citing late-night meetings and personal familiarity as evidence of something improper going on beneath the surface of the work. He copied half the building's ownership group on it, cast the whole thing wide enough that there was no version of the story where it stayed quiet. I read the email standing at the model unit's kitchen island, the same island where everything would later happen, my phone screen lighting up the marble beneath it, the rest of the unfinished unit dark and quiet around me. I read it twice, slowly, the way you read something you want to make sure you're not misunderstanding out of anger, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very quiet. The particular stillness that comes right before a decision, the kind of calm that isn't peace so much as it is control. I didn't call anyone. I didn't defend myself in a reply all, didn't draft the furious response that sat half-formed in my head for a moment before I let it go. I just set my phone down on the counter and stood there for a long moment, looking out at the skyline, letting the anger pass through me instead of out of me, the way I'd learned to do a long time ago, back when getting angry out loud had never once solved anything for me. Dana came to find me not long after, later that same evening, having clearly heard about the email the moment it landed in her own inbox. She stood in the doorway of the unit, with the clipboard in her hands, holding it against her chest, almost like a shield, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked like she wasn't sure how to start a sentence. I'd never seen that particular hesitation on her before. Not once in 3 years, not through any deadline or difficult client or budget dispute. It didn't suit her, and somehow that made it land harder than if she'd walked in furious, fists clenched, ready to go to war on my behalf. "I'm not going to fight him," I said, before she'd even found her words, because I could see the fight already building in her shoulders, and I wanted to head it off before it cost her something she'd regret spending. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." We didn't say much else that evening. She set the clipboard down on the island, the same spot where it would end up again months later, and sat with me for a while, the two of us not talking, the city doing its slow fade into evening outside the glass, streetlights blinking on one by one below us, the whole skyline gradually lighting itself up like it had somewhere better to be. It was enough, somehow, that she'd chosen to be there instead of somewhere easier, instead of at home, instead of anywhere that didn't involve standing beside a man who'd just told her he wasn't going to defend himself. Frank called a meeting 2 days later. The whole management team assembled in the same conference room where I'd first met him 3 years earlier. The same table, the same view of the river through the window. He didn't ask Derek to explain himself. He didn't ask me to defend anything either. Didn't so much as glance in my direction like he needed my testimony on the matter at all. He simply walked into the room, set a thick folder down on the table, and opened it to the first page. A full review of the Fulton Market project from 3 years earlier, signed off by the building's own management group, every finding documented in black and white, every line item accounted for. "This is what Ryan's work looks like," he said, sliding it across the table toward the rest of the room. Letting the folder do the talking, he'd clearly decided not to do himself. "That's all I need to know." Nobody said anything for a moment. Derek's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue, didn't offer a defense, just sat there with his hands flat on the table, unmoving, staring at the folder like it might rearrange itself if he looked hard enough, like there was some angle in it he hadn't yet found, some crack in the paperwork he could still exploit. Frank looked directly at him, unhurried, the way a man looks at someone he's already decided he doesn't need to raise his voice at. "You built a good case," he said. "Wrong target." The room stayed silent after that. I could hear the air conditioning humming somewhere behind the walls, could see the edge of the old folder's first page. Frank's signature faded slightly with age, a date stamp from 3 years back in the corner. Ink gone a shade lighter than it once had been. Derek didn't move for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, the slow arithmetic of a man realizing the room had already decided without him. Then he closed his own folder, gathered it under his arm, and walked out without another word, his footsteps fading down the hallway outside. And something in the room loosened the moment the door shut behind him, like everyone had been holding a breath they hadn't noticed they were holding. Dana didn't look at me during any of it. She kept her eyes on Frank, and I understood, even then, that whatever passed between them in that silence belonged to the two of them, a conversation years in the making that had nothing to do with words at all, and everything to do with a father finally watching his daughter get to keep something good without a fight taking it from her. After that meeting, Derek was removed from the subcontract entirely, a decision made by the joint management team, not by Frank alone, and not by me either, a decision rooted plainly in his own conduct, rather than anyone taking sides on a matter that had never really needed sides in the first place. The paperwork cited unprofessional conduct, nothing more specific than that, and nobody in the room argued the point. Not the ownership group, not the site supervisor, nobody who might have once considered giving him the benefit of the doubt the way I had. He didn't fight it. He gathered his things from the site office 2 days later while I was in another part of the building, and by the time I came back through, he was already gone, his name already crossed off the subcontractor list posted by the elevator, the space where it had been left blank until someone got around to updating the sheet properly. I heard, through Carol, that he'd taken another job across town within the month. Some smaller firm willing to overlook whatever reputation had followed him out of the Whitfield project, a firm that likely hadn't asked too many questions about why a man with his credentials was suddenly available on short notice. I didn't feel much of anything hearing that. No satisfaction, no lingering anger, not even the small, petty relief I might have expected from myself. He simply stopped being a variable in my week, the way a storm passes and you stop checking the sky for it once the sun's been out long enough that you trust it's going to stay. I stayed behind in the conference room a while after everyone else had cleared out, the folder Frank had brought still sitting open on the table, nobody having bothered to close it, its pages catching the late afternoon light coming through the tall windows. Dana had gone downstairs to see the technical team off, walking Derek's old crew out to their trucks with the same professionalism she brought to everything, and for a few minutes I was alone with that same clipboard, still resting on the table where she'd set it down at the start of the meeting. I looked at it for longer than I meant to. The corners were worn soft, the stitching along one edge starting to give, the way it had been giving a little more every year since Frank first put it in my hands. I found myself thinking back to the day he'd handed it to me. 3 years earlier, in that same building, in a room not far from this one, remembering the exact weight of it, the exact words he'd used. "Keep this. A man who does good work deserves something that lasts." I hadn't thought much about that sentence at the time. It had felt like something a proud client says to a young designer. Nothing more, a nice thing to say at the end of a job well done, the kind of sentiment that gets forgotten by both parties within a week. Standing there now, it felt like something else entirely, like a sentence with a second meaning, hidden inside the first one, waiting years for someone to notice it, patient in a way I hadn't known a piece of furniture could be patient. And for the first time, standing there in that quiet room, I let myself actually ask the question I'd been circling around for months, the question I'd been too careful, or too afraid, to put into words before now. Why had Dana been the one to hand it over? Frank was standing right there that day. He could have given it to me himself, could have said the words himself, could have made the whole gesture belong entirely to him, the way it would have if he'd simply handed it across the table on his own. He chose not to. He let her be the one, let her hands be the ones I remembered years later, Let her be the reason I kept it on the corner of my desk instead of forgetting about it in a drawer somewhere. Dana came back into the room a few minutes later, her heels quiet against the carpet this time instead of the hallway's bare concrete, and she saw me standing there with the clipboard in my hands, and she stopped in the doorway, one hand still on the frame. "Why did you give me the clipboard 3 years ago?" I asked her, no preamble, no easing into it, because I'd spent enough months easing around this particular question already. Frank could have given it to me himself. She looked at me for a long moment before she answered, and I watched something pass behind her eyes. Some decision being made in real time, the kind of decision you can see a person make even when they haven't said a word yet. "Because I wanted an excuse to put something in your hands," she said, and her voice didn't waver saying it, not even slightly, like she'd rehearsed the honesty of it long before she ever expected to need it. The room went very quiet after that. I could hear the air conditioning cycling somewhere behind the wall, could hear my own pulse a little louder than usual, could hear, faintly, the elevator somewhere down the hall opening and closing for someone who had no idea what was happening in this particular room. "And now?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped, quieter than I'd ever heard it. Quieter than the night by the parking garage, quieter than any version of her I'd encountered in 3 years of working together. "My father said you needed a wife." A pause, long enough that I thought that might be all she'd say, long enough that I nearly filled the silence myself before I caught myself and let her finish it. Then, and I said, "He was right." I didn't respond immediately. I stood up and walked to the window instead, needing the distance for a moment, needing somewhere to put my eyes that wasn't her face. I looked out over Lincoln Park, the trees still bare from a winter that hadn't fully let go yet, a few stubborn patches of snow still clinging to the shaded side of the paths below. I thought about the 3 years that had passed since that first project, about the clipboard sitting on the corner of my desk the entire time, untouched, unexplained, a question I'd never let myself ask out loud. Not once, not even to myself in any serious way. About the late evenings she'd spent working quietly beside me at that same kitchen island, never once needing an invitation, never once needing a reason beyond the fact that she wanted to be there, and how I'd told myself, every single time, that it was simply proximity, simply convenience, simply 2 people who happened to be in the same building at the same hour. I turned back around. "I've been sitting on that clipboard for 3 years, I said, and saying it out loud made the whole thing feel real in a way it hadn't been until that exact moment, like naming something finally gave it enough weight to matter. She looked at me, and there was no rush in her expression, no urgency, just a kind of stillness that felt earned rather than patient, the stillness of someone who'd already done all her waiting and had nothing left to prove by rushing now. "I know," she said. "I was waiting." I didn't ask her what she'd been waiting for. I already knew, had known for longer than I wanted to admit. I walked back across the room, picked the clipboard up off the table, feeling the same worn leather under my palm that I'd felt 100 times before without ever once understanding what it actually meant, and placed it into her hands the same way it had once been placed into mine. "Then let's stop making excuses," I said. She took it from me without a word, held it against her chest the way she had the night Derek's email arrived. Except this time there was nothing defensive in the way she held it, nothing braced or guarded about it at all. And for the first time since I'd known her, I watched her shoulders drop, just slightly, the way a person's shoulders drop when they finally set down something they've been carrying for far longer than anyone around them realized. Longer, maybe, than even she had let herself realize until this exact moment. Frank called me that night. I almost didn't pick up, still turning the whole afternoon over in my head, sitting alone in my apartment with the lights off, the city glowing faintly through the window, the only light in the room. But I answered on the 4th ring anyway, some instinct telling me it wasn't a call I should let go to voicemail. He didn't ask about Dana. He didn't mention the meeting, or Derek, or any of it, didn't fish for details the way another man might have, curious about what had happened after he'd left the conference room. He just said, "Good work today," in the same easy tone he always used, the same tone from 3 years earlier when he'd told me I had the eyes of someone who paid attention, and then he hung up before I could say anything back. I sat there for a moment holding the phone after the call ended, and I understood, with a certainty I couldn't have explained to anyone, that he knew exactly what had happened in that conference room, knew it the way a man knows something without needing to be told, the way you know rain is coming before the first drop falls. He'd probably known it was coming before either of us did, had probably known it for longer than either of us would have guessed, watching from a careful distance the entire time. Maybe that was the whole point of the clipboard from the very beginning. A slow-moving plan set into motion 3 years earlier by a man patient enough to let two people find their own way to the same conclusion, in their own time, without ever once pushing them toward it directly, without ever once naming what he was actually doing while he did it. I didn't call Dana back that night. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in that quiet conference room. Nothing that needed adding to a moment that had already landed exactly where it needed to land, no gesture that could improve on the one that had already happened. I just sat by my own window for a long time, watching the last of the daylight fade out over the city, thinking about a clipboard and a folder full of old drawings and a father who'd waited 3 years to say 4 words out loud that his daughter had apparently been ready to hear since the very beginning, maybe even before she'd let herself admit it to Carol in a break room over 2 cups of coffee. The next morning, everything looked the same from the outside. The site meetings continued. The construction schedule didn't change. Nobody at Whitfield Properties said anything different to either of us. No announcement, no shift in how people addressed us in the hallway, and if anyone suspected what had shifted between Dana and me, they had the decency not to make it a topic of conversation in front of either one of us. Carol gave me a look one morning near the elevators that told me she knew, or at least suspected, but she didn't say a word, just smiled slightly and went on her way with her coffee. But something had changed, quietly. Underneath all of that ordinary routine, the way the foundation of a building changes long before anyone above ground notices the difference, the way a structure can be entirely different underneath the same familiar surface, holding weight in a way it never could before, and nobody walking through the finished rooms would ever know how much had shifted beneath their feet to make that possible. By July, nothing about our routine looked different from the outside. We still saw each other at site meetings, still walked through progress reports with the rest of the team, still kept the same professional distance in front of everyone else on the project, the same handshake at the start of a meeting, the same nod at the end of one, but something had shifted underneath it. Quietly, the way things shift when two people finally stop pretending not to notice each other, when the pretending itself simply stops being worth the effort it used to take. Some nights, after 9, my phone would light up with her name, and she'd ask me some question about a material decision that could have easily waited until morning, some detail about a finish or a fixture that didn't actually require an answer at that hour. I never once let it go to voicemail. I never once hung up first either, and some nights, the actual question only lasted a minute or 2 before the conversation drifted somewhere else entirely, somewhere neither of us bothered naming. One evening, she showed up at my apartment in Wicker Park, no folder, no clipboard, nothing work-related at all, just 2 coffees in her hands, one for each of us, still warm from the shop around the corner from my building. I opened the door and found her standing there, and for a moment neither of us said anything, because there was no reason for her to be there except that she wanted to be, and we both understood that without needing to say it out loud. She stepped inside like she'd done it a dozen times before, though it was the first, and she looked around my apartment slowly, taking in the sketches on the wall, the clipboard on my desk, the general spareness of a place that had never expected company, and something in her expression softened as she took it all in, like she was reading the room the same careful way she read a set of drawings. She sat on the windowsill in my living room, looking out at the street below, the evening traffic moving slow beneath the streetlights, and I sat across from her, and we talked about nothing important for over an hour, the kind of conversation that doesn't need a purpose because the purpose is simply being in the room together. She told me about a house she'd grown up in on the north side, a place her father had sold years ago that she still sometimes drove past out of habit, slowing down without meaning to whenever the route took her that direction. I told her about the first apartment I'd ever designed, a disaster of a project that had taught me more than any success ever could have, a client who'd wanted 5 different styles crammed into one small space and had somehow blamed me when none of it worked together. She laughed, a real laugh, not the polite version she saved for meetings, and I realized I hadn't heard that particular sound from her before and that I wanted to hear it again. I watched her sitting there, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup, and I realized this was the first time I'd ever seen her without something to carry. No clipboard, no folder, no papers tucked under her arm, no phone in her hand checking a message from the site. Just her hands, empty, resting in her lap, and something about that emptiness felt more intimate than anything she could have handed me, more revealing than any document she'd ever passed across a table. I understood, watching her, that this was Dana, with nothing to hide behind. No title, no folder full of decisions to defend, and I found I liked her just as much this way as I had every other way I'd known her. Maybe even more, because there was nothing performed about it at all. Frank knew. He never said anything directly to either of us, never made a comment or asked a question, but I caught him once at the site, standing a few feet back from where Dana and I stood together, looking over a set of finished drawings, watching us for a moment longer than a passing glance would require, his expression unreadable but not unkind. Then he turned and said something quiet to Carol, who'd been standing beside him, and she nodded, and neither of them looked at us again for the rest of that visit, though I noticed Carol smiling to herself as she walked away, the small, satisfied smile of someone who'd guessed right about something months ago and was only now getting confirmation. He never brought it up with me directly either. Not once. Though there were moments when I caught him looking at Dana and me with something close to relief in his expression, the look of a man who'd been carrying a worry for a long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. A worry I suspect he'd been carrying since long before he ever thought to hand me that clipboard. I think, in his own quiet way, that was Frank's version of celebrating. Not a toast, not a speech, just a look across a room and the decision to let the two of us find our own footing without interference, the same patience he'd shown from the very beginning of all of this. The project moved into its final stretch that summer. Construction crews finishing out the last few floors, systems getting tested one by one, elevators running their first cycles, water pressure checked on every level, HVAC systems humming to life for the first time in rooms that had sat quiet and unfinished for the better part of a year. Dana and I walked through the building together one final time before the punch list closed out, moving from floor to floor, checking details neither of us needed to check anymore because the work was already done and done well, running our hands along finished countertops and testing light switches purely out of habit rather than necessity. It felt less like an inspection and more like a farewell to a building we'd both spent a year of our lives inside, a building that had somehow become the place where the two of us had actually happened, even though neither of us had planned it that way. We ended up in the same model unit, where everything had started, the same kitchen island, the same view of the skyline through the same wall of glass, the same stone countertop that had once held an untouched bottle of wine on the evening. This whole thing finally came into the open. "You think people will actually live here the way you imagined?" she asked me, standing near the window with her arms crossed loosely, looking out at the same view I'd been looking at the first day Frank called me about this project. "I think they'll stop and breathe for a second," I told her. That's enough. It was the same thing I'd believed the very first day I walked into this building, and somehow it felt more true now than it had then. She looked at me for a long moment, longer than the question required, and didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. I'd learned, by then, that some of her most important sentences were the ones she never spoke out loud, the ones that lived entirely in a look across a room, in the way she held still instead of moving on to the next thing. 14 months passed after that, quietly, the way most of the important stretches of a life pass, without a single dramatic marker to separate one week from the next. 14 months of ordinary life, folding quietly into something that no longer needed announcing to anyone, because by then, everyone who mattered already knew, and there was nothing left to explain to people who'd been watching this unfold from the very beginning, some of them longer than either Dana or I had realized ourselves. In September, the following year, the Lincoln Park building held its grand opening. The lobby full of people from the ownership group, city officials, a few members of the press who covered real estate for the local papers, waiters moving through the crowd with trays of drinks. Nobody seemed in any particular hurry to finish. The building's facade lit up for the first time that evening, every window glowing gold against the darkening sky, and I stood there watching it with a strange kind of pride I hadn't expected to feel, the particular pride of watching something you built with your own hands finally come alive in front of strangers who had no idea how many months of quiet decisions had gone into every wall and window they were admiring. Frank stood beside me and Dana for most of the evening, looking healthier than he had the winter before, his color better, his energy steadier, his handshake, with each new arrival just as firm as it had been the first day I'd ever met him. At one point he simply placed a hand on my shoulder, said nothing, and left it there for a long moment before moving on to greet someone else in the crowd. He didn't need to say anything. The weight of his hand said enough, said more than any toast or speech could have managed, and I understood it as the closest thing to a blessing a man like Frank was ever going to give out loud. Back in my apartment in Wicker Park, the same clipboard still sat on the corner of my desk, exactly where it had always been, the leather a little more worn now than it had been even a year earlier. But beside it now sat a new ruler and a small stack of hand-drawn sketches in handwriting that wasn't mine, notes Dana had left one evening while waiting for me to finish a call, little margin drawings of nothing in particular, the kind of doodles a person makes when their mind is somewhere pleasant and their hand just follows along. Dana had started leaving her own things in my apartment without ceremony, without asking. The way you leave things in a place you've decided you belong, a toothbrush in the bathroom, a jacket over the back of a chair, small, ordinary claims staked one at a time, without either of us ever discussing it directly. Life didn't turn into anything dramatic after that. I still designed interiors. She still managed projects for her father's company. We didn't move in together with any fanfare, didn't announce anything to anyone, just let the natural shape of two lives already leaning toward each other settle into place on its own schedule. But some mornings, before either of us left for work, she'd sit at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, not saying much, not needing to say much, and I'd stand at the counter watching her for a moment before starting my own morning, before the two of us headed off in our separate directions to spend the day building things, quite literally, for other people. It was such a small thing, that quiet, ordinary presence across the table from me, but it was the thing I hadn't known I was missing until I finally had it. The thing that made an empty apartment feel, for the first time in years, like somewhere I actually wanted to come home to, rather than simply somewhere I happened to sleep between one long day of work and the next. I look at that clipboard now, sitting on my desk the way it always has, sitting exactly where it sat for years, and I understand it differently than I did the day Frank first handed it to me. It isn't just something a proud client passed along to a young designer. It's something Dana carried in her own hands for 3 full years before she ever let herself hand it back to me the way she meant it, before she found the nerve to make the gesture mean what it had always secretly meant, and I spent those same 3 years walking right past the truth of it, every single day, without once stopping long enough to see it clearly, too busy with drawings and deadlines to notice what was sitting quietly on the corner of my own desk. The most important things, I've learned, are rarely said outright. They get delivered sideways. through small gestures nobody bothers to name at the time, gestures that only make sense years later. Once you finally have the context to understand them, once enough time has passed for the pattern to reveal itself. A woman sitting down beside you to work in silence when she didn't have to be there at all. A clipboard set on a table like it's the only reason she came, when really, it was only ever the excuse. A door left slightly open in case you ever decided to walk through it, propped there for years without her ever once forcing the issue. I was the last one to understand what was happening, the way the person at the center of a story is often the last to see the shape of it clearly. Everyone around me saw it long before I did. Carol saw it in a break room over coffee. From a handful of ordinary words Dana never meant as a confession. Frank saw it standing at a distance during a sight walk, patient enough to let it happen without ever pushing, watching two people find their own way there instead of dragging them toward it himself. Even Dana understood it years before I let myself catch up, understood it the day she watched her father hand me a clipboard, and decided, quietly, to make sure I kept it. I was simply the one holding the clipboard, unaware the whole time of exactly what I'd been given, carrying it around my own apartment for years like a man who doesn't know he's carrying a key to something. Frank's 4 words weren't really about me being lonely, weren't really about pity or worry over a man who lived by himself with sketches on his walls and nothing on his shelves. I don't think he ever worried about that. Not really. Not the way people worry about a man living alone, with sketches on his walls and no photographs anywhere. He said what he said because he already knew what his daughter had decided a long time ago, and he was simply the one brave enough to say it out loud, before either of us found the nerve ourselves. The one willing to spend a single sentence to save the two of us months, maybe years, of circling around something we'd both already chosen without admitting it. The clipboard still sits on my desk today. Worn corners, loose stitching, exactly as it always was, the same imperfect object it's been since the day Frank first put it in my hands. I never replaced it. I never will. Some things don't need to be new to matter. They just need to have been carried by the right hands, held by someone who understood its weight long before I ever did. She didn't come that evening to hand me a contract. She came to hand me something she'd been holding since the day we met, and I finally had the good sense to take it. Have you ever had someone hold something out to you for years? Quietly, patiently, and only realized much later exactly what they'd been offering the entire time. What would you have done, in that same room, if someone's father looked you in the eye and told you exactly what you already needed to hear but hadn't found the courage to admit? If this story found its way to you tonight, and something about it settled somewhere close to home, leave a like before you go. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and drop the word clipboard in the comments below if you've ever held on to something or someone too long before you finally let it go, or finally let it in. I read every single one, and I'd like to hear which part of this stayed with you longest.